So welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the World Bank's Mitigation Action Assessment Protocol. I can see here that several of you are old NAM Academy alumni, and some of you actually have participated in some of the courses. I think some others might have joined the e-learning course. Well, anyway, it's good to see you here. My name is Federico Antonio Cano. I work at the UNEP DTU Partnership, and I have in the last years been in charge for the NAM Academy courses. But on to today's presentations, and during this webinar, we've seen that due to the later developments in the UNEP CCC negotiations, we have put the NAM Academy on hold, and we are still, we're in the process of restructuring our capacity building curriculum. But we also still see NAMAS as being an important implementation framework for mitigation actions, also in the context of the Paris Agreement. And this also regardless of if we are going to keep the NAMA term in the future or if new terms will arise from the implementation of the NDCs. But from what we can see now, NAMAs are still a term being used, amongst others by the GCF. So I hope we're still going to keep this framework and not having to reinvent the wheel in the future. So let me start this welcome introduction. So in relation to our work with NAMAs and assisting the developing countries in designing and implementing mitigation actions, the UNEP DTU Partnership has, through cooperation with the World Bank, assisted in piloting the Mitigation Action Assessment Protocol, or MAAP for short. The MAAP is an assessment tool which can have multiple functions. It can assist in identifying strengths and weaknesses in mitigation action design. This allows practitioners to improve the completeness of their NAMAs. Also, by providing an overview of the different assessment areas, it can enhance transparency of the mitigation action and is therefore useful in communicating the benefits and the strengths of the mitigation action to external stakeholders. And also, the assessment criteria, as I said, are a result of a broad stakeholder consultation, and the MAAP is designed to ensure the assessment is as objective as possible, which can enhance the trust in the assessment from external stakeholders. And finally, MAAP also is designed in order to provide a tool to facilitate the evaluation of the value of carbon assets and facilitate the establishment of carbon markets. Our colleague from the World Bank, Miguel Rescalvo, will probably be able to describe this aspect better than me in the later presentation. But so all in all, we see MAAP as a tool that NAMA practitioners like yourselves can use, and you can benefit from it in the design of the mitigation action. And we thought it would be relevant to introduce the NAM Academy alumni to this practical and ready-to-use tool. So going over to the agenda, start with the welcome and introduction. That's where we are now. It will be followed up by an introduction shortly by me again, introducing the MAAP tool, and this will be followed up by Miguel Rescalvo, consultant for the World Bank. He will present a little bit of the development of the MAAP tool and presenting how the MAAP online is and how it works. After that, I will take over once again, and I will talk a little bit about how to perform a MAAP assessment and our experience with piloting the assessments with a specific amount of mitigation actions. Then we'll round up with question and answers and discussion. So you're welcome to send in questions during the presentations through the chat function. And we will try to do our best to answer them at the end of the webinar during the Q&A discussion session. So just a second for me to launch the presentation. So I want to start the presentation by setting the MAAP into the context of the later developments in the UNEP CCC negotiations, by presenting some of the challenges that we can see there are in implementing the Paris Agreement and how MAAP can be utilized to enhance the design of mitigation actions. So I will first talk about some of the challenges in implementing the ambitious targets set out by the Paris Agreement. Then I will introduce some of the terminology from the Paris Agreement and how it relates to MAAP. Then one of the hot topics, how are mitigation actions financed in terms of international support, and what has been observed are the challenges in achieving and providing finance for mitigation actions. And then finally, I will round up on how the MAAP can contribute in overcoming the mentioned challenges. So introducing the status quo, we are in a situation where we have the Paris Agreement, which sets out very ambitious global targets that will require a large scale-up in implementation of mitigation actions. But at the same time, we also see that developing countries express the lack of finance to implement mitigation actions. While this is the case, we also see that there are actually large amounts of unspent funds from international climate finance providers. So we need to find a way to match the mitigation actions, or the NAMAs, and the available finance that is out there. Also, the Paris Agreement opens up for collaborative approaches to meet national mitigation goals. But there is still a lot of uncertainty regarding how the new market mechanism will look like and how cooperative approaches will be enabled. And finally, the Paris Agreement puts emphasis on the need to track the progress of implementation of the targets, this to be done both at the national and international level. And here one of the challenges, as expressed by many developing countries, is the capacities needed to track the progress and report to the UNFCCC. So the ambition of the Paris Agreement is introduced and presented in its Article 2, quoting, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And from Article 4, reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. So this high level of ambition requires, as mentioned, not only single emission reductions progress, but also there is an emphasis on transformative actions that have to impact the overall economy and transform whole sectors. To achieve these very ambitious targets, science actually shows that massive efforts will be needed, and countries will have to implement mitigation actions at a large scale and very fast. Actually, science also shows that we will not be able to reach the target unless we also start capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. And Article 2 also put this target into an environmental perspective, stressing the need to implement mitigation actions with a focus on environmental integrity. So taking this into consideration and putting it into relation with MAAP, the MAAP tool has a wide range of indicators related to sustainable development, environmental integrity, and safeguards. And this, this can assist in designing or consider these aspects in your NAMA or mitigation action design and frame it into this context. So implementing the required amount of mitigation actions to reach the global targets will also require a large mobilization of financial resources. But while NAMAs or mitigation action implementers experience a lack of financing opportunities for their mitigation actions, at the same time, we also see that international donors struggle to find investment-ready projects. So to illustrate this, the writing is quite small from the figure, but in the UNFCCC NAMA registry, only 18 of the, or that's approximately 13% of registered NAMAs are registered as supported. So where the mitigation action has matched a financier that will support at least part, and in many situations, a small part of the costs of implementation. So yes, we have a lot of mitigation action designs or NAMAs, but very few of them are financed. Also, during the COP23 in Bonn on November 13, the 5th NAMA facility call for proposal was announced. Here, the UK, Germany, and the European Commission and Denmark have provided additional funding. I think we are a total of up to 85 million euros for the fifth call, but they also acknowledge that there is a need for high quality mitigation action designs, for mitigation actions with ambition and transformative actions. But it also seems like they have a hard time finding mitigation actions of good enough design according to their assessment standards. Another example regarding the donor-recipient gap is the GCF. Here, the GCF, we could see, could only disperse 168 million US dollars out of the 909 million US dollars available in 2015. I think that's where the first round of projects came. And only around half of the 2 billions that they had available in 2016. And now in 2017, only 2.7 billion out of the 10.1 signed billions that they had available has been committed to spend in 2017. So there is a lot of unspent funds. And the GCF has also put a focus on ambitious and well-designed mitigation actions, but they also seems to struggle with finding mitigation actions with good enough quality. And this is actually, to put it, to give a practical example, the round of projects from 2016 we know was approved despite some vocal concerns about the project quality from the technical review committee. So we have a situation that leads to frustration on both sides. On one side, we have mitigation action practitioners or NAMAP practitioners which feel they don't know how to please the financiers, while financiers feel that they don't get enough quality mitigation actions to finance. And finally, I mean, this leads to in a situation where we're getting delayed in implementation, and it becomes even harder to meet the global goals set out by the Paris Agreement. And here, I mean, we see that the MAAP can assist in providing a tool for self-assessment. So the NAMAP practitioners can identify gaps and areas of improvement in their mitigation action design. And I mean, who knows, maybe also having a MAAP assessment made might also enhance trust by the financiers, even though they have their own assessment requirements. But if you have your mitigation action already assessed through MAAP, that could provide an initial trust by the potential financiers. So over to the cooperative approaches. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement mentions cooperative approaches to implement mitigation actions and achieve ambitious NDC targets. So quoting the Paris Agreements, some parties choose to pursue voluntary cooperation in the implementation of the nationally determined contributions and cooperative approaches that involve the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes towards nationally determined contributions. So even though there is still a lot of uncertainty, as mentioned, regarding how the new market mechanism will look like and how these cooperative approaches will be enabled, we know that to be able to have a market, we also need to be able to compare what we're exchanging. Previously under Kyoto, we had the CDM, for instance, with very clear rules on how this offsetting could happen. This again gave rise to several different providers which could vouch for this comparability as a gold standard, the VCS, etc. But in the current context, we need to be able to compare mitigation goals and mitigation programs. And here the MAAP could also provide an input by aligning the assessment results to the criteria of the counterparts. So over to transparency. The Article 13 of the Paris Agreement focuses on this specific term, and it says that there is a need for clarity and tracking of progress towards achieving parties' individual nationally determined contributions under Article 4, including good practices, priorities, needs, and gaps in accounting for anthropogenic emissions and removals corresponding to the national determined contributions. Parties shall promote environmental integrity, transparency, accuracy, completeness, comparability, and consistency. So a lot of words here, but there is a huge emphasis on transparency. We can call it transparency, we can call it MRV, but since all countries are on board and we have targets for all countries will also be required to report back to the new UNEP DTU on their progress. And here the MAAP tool, I mean, it has a wide range of indicators related to transparency, or we call it MRV, or monitoring on an evaluation. But this could assist in identifying how the MRV system of the mitigation action, and also some of the indicators related to the national level, how these could be improved. And at the same time, the assessment might also assist in identifying potential needs and gaps. And this identification could be used for instance, assistance requests, or also reporting to the UNEP DTU on the priorities, needs, and gaps. So finally, to sum up, I would like to reiterate that to achieve the very ambitious goals that we have set out in the Paris Agreement, we need well-designed NDC implementation plans. And these must consist of well-designed mitigation actions, or NAMAs, if you so like. Here, the MAAP tool can assist NAMA designers in providing a tool for self-assessment when NAMA designers engaged in defining the scope of the mitigation actions, and also to identify the gaps to improve the NAMA design as the design evolves. It will also provide a common assessment framework which can be utilized internally in the country. It could be used to compare the potential NAMAs that are in the pipeline and prioritize among them, but also provide a common framework to present them to potential cooperation stakeholders. And finally, it may also assist you in identifying specific MRV gaps at the national and NAMA level, where good MRV at both levels will actually be important to allow for a robust transparency framework at the international level. This also creates trusts by financiers. And the MAAP tool is also here, as the link shows, is available online and can be accessed through the link. Miguel will present more on this. And I think he will now take over and elaborate more on the MAAP, its purpose, and its structure. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Federico. I hope that you can all see my screen now. And so I would like, first of all, thanks all of you that have joined this webinar, and also DTU. DTU has been a partner of the World Bank in this process of developing and implementing the MAAP from the very beginning, and we have had a fantastic cooperation with the entire team, and specifically with Federico. And I would like to thank both DTU and Federico for that. I'm Miguel Rescalvo, a consultant to the World Bank. I've been working on the network carbon markets unit of the bank for some time as a consultant, specifically focused on how to assess the progress done by different countries under the Paris Agreement, and specifically mitigation actions, and that is what led to the development of the MAAP and the MAAP tool. So please allow me a few minutes to try to describe the context in which MAAP was developed. Some of that has been very well described by Federico already. Also, the rationale, the vision, and the objectives we had when we developed MAAP, and how it fits in the strategy of the World Bank Group to develop markets and to promote the agreements of done in Paris. And third, I will describe some of the activities that we have done in the implementation phase. And then Federico will go back to explain some specific cases that they worked on, and also show some more specific functionalities of the online tool we developed. So in the context, as I already said, Federico has very well described the new reality brought to us by the Paris Agreement. I will not go through it again. I took 2 or 3 main points from his presentation that actually are amazing. This gap between the donor-recipient feelings, right, and the effort we all need to make to reach these 2-degree targets. In that context, the only thing I would like to point out here is the need to use markets and market mechanisms to be able to reach these targets. That's already been recognized by countries, as you may have heard before. NDCs of 84 countries call for markets and carbon pricing mechanisms, including 72 in developing countries. And I would also point out to the need of linking related to the cooperation that Federico already mentioned, and how linking those carbon instruments and markets can actually help us to not only to reach this 2 degrees goal, but also reducing the cost of doing that. So the context, the reality that the Paris Agreement brought to us, and also mentioned by Federico, is the reality is promoting a bottom-up approach to mitigation and to climate action. It promotes countries to align the instruments they use for mitigation with their national priorities, in the context of a comprehensive strategy to sustainable development, coupling not only mitigation of GHG emissions, but also doing that in the context of their sustainable development strategy. This bottom-up approach, I think we can all agree that is what we needed. It also brings some challenges, and the challenge is that we find now ourselves in a context where we have regulatory instruments being used by countries to mitigate emissions, like GHG performance standards, fuel standards. We find and we see price-based mechanisms like cap and trade, like project-based mechanisms like the ones promoted by Japan and the CDM, white and green certificates, carbon tax is one of the new trends, feed-in tariffs promotion, and other more aligned with innovation and research and development implemented by different jurisdictions. So we recognize that this bottom-up approach is good, specifically because of this alignment with the national priorities for development. And we also recognize that linking and the cooperation among these mechanisms is needed to achieve our goals. We need to face the reality that linking instruments that they have nothing to do with each other is a new challenge we have never faced before. We are coming from a top-down approach where UNFCCC was setting the rules for every single CDM project that was developed or joint implementation or the ETS. And now we are facing the reality of the very interesting proposal of Articles 6.2, specifically in this cooperation, and 6.4, even when we may agree that 6.4 will be more like the old CDM and is under the command and control of the UNFCCC, not the case of 6.2. So, in summary, if we need transparency, as Federico said, and international climate markets are, I would say, you can see in the screen, desirable. I would say they are actually needed. Then the reality is that governments and market participants need information about the schemes that they are cooperating with. And as we mentioned before, the reality is that there is a lack of comparability as the result of this bottom-up approach that we are promoting now. So this is the context where MAAP was developed already a few years ago, and you will see that in a few screens. But what we knew in the bank even before the Paris Agreement was in place, was that whatever was going to happen in this international cooperation, the way of assessing the progress towards achieving these international goals had to be different to the validation and verification we had seen under the Kyoto Protocol. It's simply this validation verification process doesn't fit this reality of a bottom-up approach, very diverse mechanisms that they need to cooperate and compare among themselves. They use this yes/no outcome on whatever a project will potentially achieve its emission reduction targets, while if we take a more comprehensive approach and we see all the mitigation actions that are being developed today to implement NDCs, we think, or we thought a few years ago already, that any assessment had to first allow a range of possible outcomes. So it didn't make any sense to have a yes/no outcome anymore. We had to develop something that was inclusive of different instruments and also inclusive of different level of development, where we could provide an input to the user in which stage the program is at each moment in time, and not only a pass/no pass process. It has to be based on a risk assessment methodology. It has to be useful to compare carbon assets. Some of the functionalities we wanted to see is that we could compare what different jurisdictions were doing. So we had this benchmarking capability where we could compare a mitigation action in one specific sector to the results of similar programs around the world in that same sector. We also saw, and one of the inputs we got is that it could not be limited to assess emission reductions. It had to be inclusive of other contribution to sustainable developments, and it had to be flexible. It had to, each different user could have the option or needed to have the option of focusing the assessment in what was important for them. So this is the context that we had when we started to develop MAAP. And the result of this process was this Mitigation Action Assessment Protocol that is structured in 4 modules. And each module gets a score between 0 and 100 points. And that score is based on the assessment and evaluation on different risk areas and key indicators. So I hope that we can agree that if we want to assess a mitigation action, for example, an AMA, we need to look at 3 main things related to the NAMA itself. Is how the program is designed. That entails assessing the targets and the objectives of the NAMA, the scope, the planning of the program, and how emission reductions are calculated, baseline estimations, emission reductions estimations, MRV. So we all know that, right? When we want to assess how the program is designed. But we also thought that equally important to have a well-designed program, we also needed to look at who is managing the program, who is the management entity, and what is the structure of that entity, what is the background of that entity managing similar processes in the past, and what resources they have available for this. And the third leg of this assessment is how the financial structuring of the NAMA, in the case of the NAMA, is done. And we look at three areas here: the financial currents, the financial stakeholders, and the monitoring of financial flows. So we think that in the MAP, that is the structure of the MAP. I said 3 modules with different assessment areas, and I'm sure that in the presentation we will see from Federico later on, we will see specific examples. So all of these 3 modules has to do with environmental integrity or the carbon integrity of the program. As I mentioned before, during the stakeholder consultation we did for developing MAP, we were getting a consistent input that we had to include not only the contribution to reducing emissions of the programs or the mitigation action, but also the contribution to sustainable development and other development benefits of the program. So, and that is what it takes care of, this module 4. So this is the structure of MAP, and here I would also like to mention that we have 2 different versions of this tool. One is focused on programs and mitigation action and NAMAs that are at the design stage, and a different version is focused on mitigation action that are under implementation. And all of that in the context of how those mitigation actions contribute to the successful implementation of NDCs. So, given all of these, what can we use MAP for? And Federico already mentioned some of these aspects, but allow me to show the vision we have for MAP at the short, medium, and long term. We strongly believe that having a tool that helps practitioners to design better mitigation actions is actually very much needed today. Specifically when we see that the Paris Agreement is being operationalized and this Paris roadbook is coming up hopefully next year. But even when some of the things are not totally defined, I think we can all agree on what the mitigation action needs to look like, which are the main building blocks of the robust mitigation action. And we think this is the first benefit of using MAP, as Federico already pointed out. So you can use MAP yourself, you can have access to the online tool, and you can do a self-evaluation of your own mitigation action, your own NAMA, and see where you are. You will get a score, as I said, from 0 to 100 points for each of the 4 modules, and it helps you to evaluate where you are very strong and where you have areas of improvement, and you can focus on them. At this stage, we also see MAP being used to prioritize mitigation actions. We have different examples of governments that are being using MAP to decide which mitigation action to implement for NDC advancement or implementation, and which ones prioritize, for example, to be financed under different cooperation or international corporations. At the medium term, we see MAP being used to compare these mitigation actions. As we already pointed out, this is an amazing challenge in the new Paris reality, right? We have so many different instruments. How do we compare them? I think what we developed helped you to do a quantitative assessment and having a quantitative result of a qualitative assessment, right? And therefore you can compare these different actions. And the long term, we think that comparing those actions and assessing and assigning a quantitative value to the assessment will help regulators to establish or to have a technical input to the concept of mitigation value, and therefore the transfer of mitigation outcomes across countries that will surely have to deal with exchange rates and the changeability of those carbon assets. So in this vision was driven by an extensive consultation process we had in the past with different users. So who is using MAAP now? So MAAP is being used by national and subnational jurisdiction, either to prioritize which actions to support, and that is the case, for example, was the case in Peru, or to assess the level of development of a national or a state level mitigation program, like is the case of the state of Jalisco in Mexico. Is being used by donors and investors to spot good projects, is being used by projects or NAMA or mitigation action developers, carbon market regulators, and obviously by multilateral development banks. We see these being the possible users of MAAP, and that these different type of 5 users will have different priorities. And as I mentioned before, MAAP is totally flexible on that and allows each of these users to focus on the areas of their interest, and the tool does that based on assigning different weights to the different assessment areas and the different modules. So one of these users can decide not to use module 3 or give a higher weight to those assessment areas that related to sustainable development. And we did all of these. We didn't start yesterday. We started actually 2014. It was done as part of the Climate Action Task Force by the World Bank in anticipation of any future international agreement. We had a stakeholder consultation group of around 46 institutions, and we also did an extensive outreach in different carbon and climate-related events. We developed it, and in April 2015, we commissioned the independent review to a number of institutions, 4, if my memory doesn't fail here, and we piloted it in different countries during 2015 and 16, and the first version came alive in May 2016, and in 1 year later, May this year, 2017, we launched an online tool. And that is what I wanted to, in the last 2 minutes of this presentation, just explain what implementation activities we've done. As I mentioned, we have this MAAP online interface. Federico will give you some more information on this. But the use of MAAP was increasing steadily over the months, and we thought that doing that with an Excel file was not very useful. We have this MAAP online tool now where it's public. You can go online and you will see that there is almost 200 mitigation actions included in the database. Some of them are doing the results public, others they kept them private for themselves, but in any case, when you want to compare your program with other programs, you are using all the data in the database, right? If you go to the World Bank MAAP online webpage, we have there different support tools. We have a video where you can see what this is about, and if we have time at the end of this session, I think Federico is planning to play the video. We have some links to support documents like a guidebook on how to interpret the assessment and other external references. And all of that has made us to reach the point where we are, where, as I said, we have more than 200 mitigation actions assessed, or close to 200, and all over the world, as you can see. Latin America, Asia, Africa, and interesting enough, MAAP was not thought only to assess mitigation actions in developing countries, but also in any country, and we ran a project for assessing low carbon city programs in the Mediterranean region that includes both cities in the north of Africa, Middle East, and Europe. One of the activities we are doing to promote MAAP is this MAAP Ambassador program that we also invited practitioners of the NAMA Academy to join us in Mexico in October. We had a big success there. We had more than 60 applications for all over the world. So we decided to focus the one in Mexico just in Latin America practitioners, and we are planning to develop a new one in Asia. The objectives of this MAAP Ambassador program is to get more and more people trained to use MAAP, to have an in-depth understanding of the MAAP tool. That includes verifiers, consultants, government officials, and if you join the MAAP Ambassador program and you complete the 3 months program successfully, you are part of the certified ambassadors list that the bank will publish when we finish the first one. And at the end of the day, all of this is to have a platform for knowledge exchange. As I mentioned, it's a 3 months training, and we are now finalizing the first one that started in Mexico last October. We have not done this alone in the bank. We have different cooperations with multiple institutions, like the one you can see here in the screen. And specifically, I wanted to mention a cooperation with UNDP, where we have, or they have developed this climate action impact tool that complements very well the MAAP online tool. So I wanted to mention this just for you not seeing that there are different tools popping up here and there to assess mitigation actions that contribute to NDCs. The climate action impact tool and the MAAP online tool complements each other. The UNDP tool focus very much and only on the Sustainable Development Goals contribution, and therefore what we are doing is promoting this tool together in different events and giving the users the option of either choosing a module 4 of the online tool or using the UNDP tool for that effect. So let me very quickly recap here, and I will be happy to answer any question you have. In summary, what we saw when a new international agreement was being discussed was that things had to be different, and that the assessment of mitigation actions in the future had to be much more comprehensive than was done in the past, mainly because we were moving from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach that led to the development of very diverse type of mitigation actions that countries and funding institutions and users need to compare and need to have information from. In that context, we developed the MAAP tool as a set of, based on a risk assessment methodology that look at 4 different models on how the mitigation action is designed and managed and structured, and it gives you a quantitative result from 0 to 100 of what you are doing. It helps you to develop, to spot your strong areas and your areas of development, and is a public tool that is online now that you can use it by yourself, or you can commission a third party, maybe one of our future MAAP ambassadors, to do it for you and have a more independent view. With this, I would like to close my presentation, and thanks you for attending, and you are welcome to ask any question after the presentations are done. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you for the kind introduction words, and thank you for presenting the MAAP tool not only in its current stage and its current purpose, but also putting it into a future context and where you see the development of the negotiations going and the future needs, and how the MAAP fits into this context. So over to my second presentation and the last one for this webinar. This is about the structure of the MAAP tool and how the UNEP DTU Partnership has used the tool in performing a pilot assessment. So I will first present the tool, the structure, and the assessment method we applied in performing the assessment and interacting with the mitigation action developers in the countries or the institutions. And I will then talk about the pilot assessment that we performed on 20 specific mitigation actions and the lessons learned from this assessment. So catching up from my previous presentation, I mentioned that the good NDC implementation needs well-designed mitigation actions, or NAMAs. And actually, the reason upward trend in submitted NAMAs that we can see from 2017, and we can also see that continuing NAMA developments align with many of the submitted NDCs, this suggests that the NAMAs will continue to be also very relevant in the post-Paris climate landscape. And here, the MAAP can assist NAMA developers, as I mentioned earlier, in self-assess their NAMA designs and improve them. It can potentially be used for comparative exercises, and also facilitate cooperative approaches, as Miguel was very good at explaining better than me. It can also finally also help identifying MRV gaps, enhance MRV design, and align it to the national MRV systems, which ultimately it will enhance the overall transparency at the national and international level. So how do we do an assessment in practice? So as Miguel showed earlier, you have the link here. The World Bank has made the tool easily accessible online. To access it, you will have to create a profile and register a new assessment. The assessment is only for, I mean, you don't need to make it public as long as you don't want to. So yes, you will have to register it, filling out the name, country, sector, phase, so design, implementation, jurisdiction type, jurisdiction being, is it subnational, national, etc. Population, that can give a view of the magnitude compared to the population or the jurisdiction you're addressing, type of mitigation actions, and etc. So from here, you will assess 4 different overall aspects of the mitigation action, as Miguel also mentioned: the design of the program, the management entity, the financial structure, and finally the development benefits. And each module has its own assessment areas, which themselves actually have their respective key indicators to assess. So now the MAAP also gives, as Miguel briefly touched upon, it gives the opportunity to assign specific weights to the different assessment areas. So this means that the users can actually have a large influence, if they so wish, to decide on the relative importance of the different aspects of the mitigation action or the NAMA. And this, we think, can be specifically relevant if the mitigation action in question should, for instance, if needed, be assessed with different criteria. For instance, if you take an NAMA on cook stoves, it might want to emphasize the sustainable development benefits of its implementation, while a NAMA on hydropower might want to emphasize the social safeguards and environmental integrity principles it has put in place. So we can adjust the importance of the different areas, and this can also be relevant for cooperative approaches. So thinking of cooperative approaches, for instance, certain NAMA financiers might have a specific focus on gender, some might have a specific focus on transparency, etc. Other kind of financiers, like commercial banks, they might be specifically interested in the financial aspects and in the financial sustainability of the investment. So the NAMA developer here can also potentially, in collaboration with the financiers, they might want to adjust the weights accordingly. Continuing on weights, the weights can also be adjusted for the specific indicators. This allows for creating priorities down to a very detailed level. For instance, a NAMA targeting a financier that supports specifically the implementation of NDCs. In this case, the key indicators related to alignment with the priorities of the jurisdiction and approval by relevant authorities might be more relevant than others. So these can also be tweaked to suit for the needs of the specific financiers. But also the MAP has pre-established standard weights for the indicators and assessment areas. So if the purpose is a general self-assessment, they can also be left as they are. So now going to the core of the assessment, it's the actual scoring of the key indicators. Here, just the picture shows the indicator which mentions the alignment of the mitigation action objectives and the jurisdictional priorities on climate change. I mean, as you can see here, all the key indicators have a predefined description. This description guides the assessor in providing the scores. So if the assessor deems that the NAMA documentation doesn't comply with the description that allows for the highest score, it will assess it with the description in the middle score. If it does not comply, then the lowest score will be given. So as you can see, the score here is provided in a range. So the top score, I mean, this, as Miguel mentioned, the score goes from 0 to 100. But here the standard assessment score is provided in range. So the top score will be from 60 to 100, where the average will be 80. The middle score is from 40 to 60, and here the average will be 50. And the lowest one is from 0 to 40, where the average is 20. And this range actually, it's a feature that both facilitates the assessment, but also ensures the increased objectivity. So an assessor might want to give, if it wasn't for ranges, he might want to give a 75, while another assessor might want to give a 70. So this kind of we'll say that it ensures an increased objectivity, so meaning that the overly positive and the negative assessors are guided both by the description itself, so the assessment needs to apply to the description, but also the extremes are eliminated by applying this score range. But in addition, the MAP also allows to give a custom score. So the assessor can actually, if it seems it appropriate, set its own score between 0 and 100. But this, in our view, should only be done providing a justification for why the standard score was altered. So by the end of the assessment, when all the key indicators have been scored, it will be possible to see the results in graphs, which is, in our view, very nice to have a visualization of the results. It is also important to note that it will virtually be almost impossible to score the highest score overall, since the scores are given in those ranges. So as long as you use the score range, the top score will be 80. So the assessment shown here is actually more positive than it might look at first glance. So now over to our experience in utilizing the tool in assessing 20 mitigation actions. We actually started out by wanting to identify mitigation actions or NAMAs suitable for the assessment. So it's suitable meaning that we wanted to select the ones that were fairly advanced in their design. So we started out by collecting 70 amongst different NAMAs we'd worked with, existing GCF proposals and other mitigation actions. And we selected those based on several criteria. One was the existence of pilot projects, which usually shows, let's say, some maturity of the mitigation action. Another one was the indication of a national co-financing, which shows country commitment. Third was the existent, or not necessarily existent, but indication of private sector participation. See, the private sector is usually a very important partner in the implementation of actions in general and mitigation actions as well. So we deem this as an indicator of advanced design. Also, the existence of facilitative regulation, which shows commitment, but also the lack of regulatory barriers that would hinder the implementation. We wanted to have some ambition in greenhouse gas emission reductions. So not single mitigation actions with low impact, but more large-scale national programs or sectoral programs. And also an indication of contribution to sustainable development, as one of the modules assesses specifically this, and is actually a requirement that is more and more present in what financiers require from mitigation actions. So, and also in addition to the selection criteria, we also try to make a selection with geographical and technological variety. So from the 70 mitigation actions, we ended up with this short list of 20 mitigation action designs that we used for the full assessment. So this shows a little bit the process that we went through in different steps while performing the assessments. So the assessment was first done by collecting all the available public information and documentation on the mitigation action. We combined this with our contacts in the countries or institutions, asking for more information where we felt the information available was not enough. And we then did a first assessment using MAAP. And here we engaged, after the assessment, with the NAMA designers or the counterparts in the institutions, where we shared the preliminary assessment with a description of how the scores were given. And here the counterparts was to give them the opportunity to comment and also share more information. And when this was done, we then revised the assessment and shared it with the counterpart again. Finally, we also selected 5 mitigation actions amongst the more interesting ones and amongst the one where the countries were responsive and were interested in go more in depth in this assessment. We selected these 5 mitigation actions where we did a country visit. So here we went to the country and engaged with the NAMA designers, consultants involved in NAMA design, and technicians and governmental staff. And this gave us the opportunity to have more in-depth discussions and receive more feedback on the applicability and design of the MAAP tool itself on one side, but also it gave us a more in-depth knowledge about the mitigation actions themselves, and upon which we made a final revised assessment for these 5 mitigation actions. And I would say that in most cases we saw that this actually enhanced the score of the assessment, having more in-depth information that was not reflected or not properly explained in the documents. In other cases, we actually saw that the score was revised downwards for specific assessment areas. because the documentation actually had overestimated impacts or that certain arrangements actually were not in place. But now, in order for the results to be even more robust, the assessment, in our view, should also, after engaging with countries, when the assessment is done, it should maybe also include a wider stakeholder engagement, where the results are open for public comments, where external stakeholders are consulted, and this would make sure that several views are represented. So it's not only UDP or a MAP ambassador doing the assessment in collaboration with the NAMA designers themselves, but also allow for external stakeholders to come with their views. But this might be the case for the future MAP if the practitioners using the MAP want to apply this approach. So this slide is a lot of information at once, so I'll try to explain in brief what it shows. It illustrates the visualization of the scores for a specific assessment during the 3 stages that I explained earlier. You can see how the score changes here in this situation for the better as more information is received and taken into consideration. So the ones to the left show the program design and the management entity assessment only using publicly available information. The one in the middle, it shows how the assessment were revised after we received the comments from the management entity. And the one to the right is how the scores actually changed after having done the country visit in the country. So you can see that the blue line indicates the maximum achievable score, while the red line is the score results for the assessment. So just if you were in doubt, but and here specifically, you can see that the MRV related and overall the management entity increases in score as more information is provided. So this multi-step process also showed us something about the importance of information and how information is shared. And I will get back to that at a later stage during this presentation. So the visualization can also be broken down to indicator level, which we did for the assessment. I mean, it goes very much into detail, so you can also visualize specific indicators. I think also one of the important things that you can get out of the visualization is that you can see how the weights influence the potential maximum score and shape of the graphs. So the indicators or the assessment areas which are assigned the highest weights are the ones that go outwards and the ones that are given most importance. Here, the next 3 slides actually illustrate the scores for the 20 mitigation actions that we assessed. And I mean, it's 20 mitigation actions. I will not go through all of them, but I will give some general views on what we can get out of the scores. We can see that most of the assessments actually lack the finance module here. And this was actually because MAP was restructured during the lifetime of this project, and the finance module was actually made while we were doing the assessments. So a lot of finance indicators were in the other modules, but there was a restructure of the tool itself. So the financial module as a separate module was only applied to some of the countries where we performed in-country visits. Here the mitigation actions in bold are the ones where we did the in-country visits. So going longer down the list of the mitigation actions, what we can say at first glance, at least by this list, is that the quality of NAMA design or mitigation action design can vary greatly, but it seems that many are actually quite good at providing an overview of the program itself. which is the green, mostly green column to the left. But at the same time, we can see that they might be lacking in describing the sustainable development aspects of the mitigation action, which is the one on the right. So this was a common feature that we saw for many of the mitigation actions, where it seemed like the development benefit aspects was a thing that came as an extra bonus to the other mitigation action documentation, while it might be worth stressing the fact that it's actually a quite important part of a mitigation action design. Similarly, here in this list, we can see that some are not as good in describing the capacity, mandates, and roles of the management entity of the mitigation action, which is the second column that we can see here. This is the module where these things are assessed. We also get a sense of the different potential levels of development of the NAMA designs. While we have one mitigation action which is quite advanced and comes out with like very green, while others are in the darker colors. This shows, and we need to acknowledge that NAMAs or mitigation actions and their documentation usually are live documents, I would say. They're being developed and revised over several cycles, so it's also natural that some are more advanced than others. In other cases, of course, this can be due to different things. It can also be due to the country and institutional capacity in the countries, data and information available, etc. But having a low score is not necessarily, shouldn't necessarily be a disincentive to do an assessment, because I mean, it's understandable that you will have a lower score at the start of your design process than at a later stage. But overall, we can see that there are some common features from the assessment. We can see that most mitigation actions designed, they don't meet the MAAP requirements to achieve overall top scores. This is the red line not filling up into the blue line. This can be due to the expectations of the MAAP, what is required to receive the top scores compared to the level of development of most NAMAs. But it should also, I would say, it should also be noted that though from what we can see from the response of international NAMA financiers, this is also the case for them. I mean, they also have expectations, and that they feel that many of the proposals that they get are not at a level of development where they actually feel secure in investing. So this, I mean, performing a MAAP assessment might actually give you also an idea of what is the level of details required from other financiers. We also see that there is a large variation in documentations and level of detail in the different mitigation actions. As you can see by these two figures, we're here illustrating barriers, how well barriers are described, where one assessment on one mitigation actions basically almost didn't mention it, while another one actually had done a great deal of work. This can, of course, be due to a different level of development and available information. I mean, the one might have done a barrier analysis and the one have not done it yet. But we also think that it's due to a lack of overall guidance and understanding of what a robust mitigation action should consist of. There is no standardized way of designing mitigation actions, really. But the MAAP here can provide a holistic guidance for NAMA design. And we also observed a general lack of detailed information on the national climate change related institutions. I mean, most of the NAMAs and mitigation actions, they focus on the mitigation program itself, but they carry a little bit the notion that they're developed by a specific ministry. it don't necessarily describe in depth how the program fits in the overall national institutional framework. The involved institutions and the respective mandates and roles and responsibilities, institutional arrangements for MRV and communication flows, etc. Which these are things that we think are also important to include when describing a mitigation action. Yes, rounding up, I'll say that we got some preliminary conclusions that show that the information of mitigation action is usually extensive. So you can get a lot of documents and a lot of information, but it's also rarely fully disseminated or publicly available. A lot of times we found NAMA documents, we found description of the mitigation actions, but when we interacted with the counterparts in the countries, on the institutions, we actually got a lot of extra information. We got a lot of extra documents that have not been made public. And I mean, some countries and NAMA designers might be reluctant to share this information publicly, but we actually think that the NAMA designers can gain from disseminating and making more information publicly and easily available. It shows that it shows that you have done your homework. It shows that you're actually done a lot of analysis, which in the end might, even though the work is not finished, in terms that it will still go through another cycle and be redeveloped and redescribed, and more details will come. It still shows that you have done a great deal of work, which in the end reassures financiers. I mean, most institutions understand that NAMAs are like this, evolving in nature. So there is no need to necessarily wait for the perfect products before disclosure, at least in my view. And connecting this to the MAAP tool, it is also possible to make an assessment of your mitigation action, not make the assessment results publicly available, so you can still make the information and the documentation available, and then work on your NAMA and redo the assessments, and when you feel confident that you have included the things needed and the assessment result is satisfactory from your end, you can also decide to make that public. So we also see that there is a need for better guidance on what is needed in mitigation action design or NAMA design, and as I mentioned earlier several times, the MAAP can potentially fill this gap. Also, think that, as I mentioned, through the weights, the MAAP provides the needed flexibility to adjust for differentiations of needs depending on sector and objectives, the possibility to adjust weights depending on institutions' own priorities, and the possibility to adjust weights depending on the stage of development of the mitigation action as well. So this was it on my end. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you, Miguel, for participating. Thank you all for listening. I think we can now go over to the questions and answer session. I don't know if there are many questions that have come in. Let's see. What are the top 5 countries that get access to GEF funds for their mitigation action or NAMA? I don't have a specific number on that now. I think we can try to look it up. I don't know if Miguel has something he would like to say about this question. Miguel, no, are you there?
No, thank you, Federico. No, unfortunately, I don't have the specific figures for that.
So I'm sorry, we don't have that information yet, but actually you can drop me an email at canu, C-A-N-U, @dtu.dk, and I will try to answer your questions. I'll write my email on the presentation here so you can have it visible. So the questions that I don't answer now, you please send them to me, and I'll do my best to answer them at a later stage. Second question here is, I can see, what are the key challenges to be underuse of funds available? I don't know if I understand the questions correctly, but the key challenges of having this underused funds, I mean, what we can see financiers and their challenge in utilizing these funds is that they are not confident that the mitigation action proposals that they receive are actually robust enough and self-sustainable enough in the end. We see a lot of proposals which base themselves on concepts which are not necessarily proven in the documentation that they will be able to materialize. So you might have a very good idea, but it's not backed up by even pre-feasibility studies. Sometimes they lack financial calculations to see if the activity will actually be able to become self-financeable in the future, or will be dependent on state subsidies forever, or will be dependent on external international support forever. So these are examples of the information that sometimes financiers are lacking when they receive proposals and that they would like to have. And these are some of the issues on which the MAP touches upon. I hope I answered this question. If not, you're welcome to resend a question. Miguel, do you want to answer? Have anything to add?
No, I think that you described it well, right? There is a mismatch between the expectations of the funders and the expectations or the capabilities of the management entities, right? And this is actually one of the gaps that MAP tries to fill, right? So if we advance in the number of donors and funders that say, well, listen, the requirements are very clear in the MAP tool, so we will consider your proposal for funding as long as your MAP score in Module 1 is higher than 80, Module 2 higher than whatever, 60, and so on. So if you get that clear signal, you can then do a self-evaluation of your program, see how close you are from that score, and you are not even close, you at least know where you need to improve, right? And we are working, and actually this work is funded by some of those financiers, and that is I think that this is how it will work in the future. So hopefully we support the process of bridging that gap between what someone wants and what someone thinks they have, right? Because sometimes that doesn't fit the reality. And we think that MAP tool can be a useful tool for helping you guys out there.
Okay, thank you. Actually, related to this, there is another question. So is the World Bank using MAP assessment to assess if they will finance mitigation actions, or do they require a good MAP assessment score done in self-assessment to provide finance? I think this is a World Bank related question. Maybe you want to answer this again.
Yeah, that's a good question. We've been working already for some months with the TTLs, the technical leaders of bank-funded projects for the adoption of MAP, and we have evaluated the number or assessed the number of programs using MAP. That is an ongoing process that has started recently and is evolving in the right direction. There is no official figure of the score you need to have or anything like that, but definitely is one of the intentions of the NCM unit to help also bank-funded projects to evolve in this process, and we are working on that internally, and we have started to do that. So in a number of programs.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Going over to another question. So when we look into mitigation actions, which actions are mainly considered? For example, approved mitigation action projects in NAMA registry, or mitigation actions included in NDC, multilateral or bilateral mitigation action projects. I don't know exactly if this question is referred to the mitigation, to the MAAP assessment that we made, or in terms of financing. So I'm going to try and answer both. So in terms of the mitigation actions that we chose for our assessment, we considered actually from all of these sources, both mitigation actions that were registered in the NAMA registry. Actually, the UNFCCC doesn't approve or disapprove of the NAMAs that are registered there. It's just a registry where the country focal points basically upload their NAMAs. But we also looked into countries' NDC and alignment between the mitigation actions and the NDCs. So we picked mitigation actions that were mentioned in NDCs for specific countries, and we also looked at some mitigation actions that were already financed through multilateral development banks and the GCF. So if the question is about finance, when we look into mitigation actions, which actions are mainly considered? So are financiers interested in the NAMAs in the registry, or NAMAs in the NDCs, or mitigation action in the NDCs? I would say that the NAMA registry so far, I don't think it has, and this is only my view, it has not been able to provide the direct matching of mitigation action or NAMAs and finance. It's more of a registry listing the different potential opportunities that are out there. What we see after the Paris Agreement, we see more and more interest in financing mitigation actions which are aligned with NDCs. So international financiers with the Paris Agreement in place are interested in seeing NDCs and NDC targets materialized. So the alignment of mitigation actions in the targets of the NDCs I see is very important. You can call it alignment, you can call it integration, you can call it embeddedness. Several institutions use several terms, but it's basically the same. Your mitigation actions should contribute to reach the national targets, and the more you can show that there is this alignment, I think the better. Next question. As it can be linked to the scheme of a local government, national, for the planning of the NDC program, and therefore the implementation of NAMA based on MAAP. If I understand the question, let's see, how to break the bottlenecks when one comes to help, but the managers feel threatened by such help? How can one protect their own initiative, which at the moment are presenting them to certain entities, appropriate them and assigned by them? If I understand the questions correctly, it's about the MAAP coming in and assessing mitigation actions which are designed and owned by managers or officials, and that they might feel threatened by having an outside assessment done. So if I understand this question correctly, I can refer to the experience we had during this pilot assessment. We saw that some countries, and especially some institutions which were not national institutions but development assistance institutions, they were a bit reluctant of having an external entity coming and assessing them and telling them basically what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, which you could say it's totally understandable. Some argued for the fact that the assessment did not take into consideration the specific situation in the country or the specific scope of the mitigation action. So for some parts, there were some reluctance in this assistance that we provided for free. But what we saw that in further engaging with them and explaining what the purpose of this assessment was, and basically providing the feedback that this assessment could give, we saw that the barricades actually went down, and it was taken as a positive contribution. And this was the very negative experiences that we have, which usually turn positive. And actually, we managed to get a lot of response on the tool itself by this very initially critical institutions. So it also helped us providing some feedback to the MAAP tool itself. On the other spectrum, you had the overly, I would say, almost positive responses, where the idea of having someone coming and providing some feedback of the NAMA designs were met with open arms from the start, and country representatives that pushed and wanted to have an in-country assessment, even though we only had the funds to do 5, and we already been there once. They wanted a second one because then they could invite the rest of the staff from that specific unit in the ministry, and they could also get training on the MAAP tool. Some other one country asking for a specific, coming back for a specific training, so the country could train their staff. So all in all, mixed, but when communication starts flowing and you provide some more information, we usually saw that the response was very positive. What would be the link between MAAP tool and national MRV system? Miguel, do you want to have some words on that? Potentially, I can also add.
Thank you, and thank you, Alejandro, for your question. You refer to national MRV system, to those that take care of the national inventory and the top-down approach of the reporting. MAAP tool is not so much focused on that today. It is more focused on to the MRV and the assessment of a specific mitigation actions that are part of the NDC implementation. Said this, obviously, MRV is a key part of the assessment of Module 1. If you recall from the presentation, the program design, and we cover all the aspects of the MRV system design and implementation in Module 1. But looking at the specific program design, what we are doing now when I refer to MAAP 2.0, that we are developing an additional module for the institutional organization around NDC implementation. There we will look a little bit more to the top-down approach, including the capacity and the legal and institutional framework for the NDC implementation. And in that context, we will take a look to how the country is doing that top-down MRV processes. But I think it's fair to say that MAAP is not an assessment tool for the national MRV process. If that clarifies your question.
If I'm allowed to add something on it, when I presented the indicators. I mean, the range of indicators of the MAAP is quite extensive, and there are definitely indicators that ask the assessor to assess the monitoring and evaluation system put in place for the mitigation action itself, asking, for instance, if internationally recognized methodologies for calculating emission reductions are put in place. And there are several indicators to assess this at the mitigation action level, but there are also some indicators which go further and ask questions into how the institutions at national level relate to each other and share information, which is also relevant for MRV and transparency. So yes, I mean, it's not an MRV assessment, but I would say that some indicators definitely touch upon the jurisdiction of where the mitigation action takes place and the institutional arrangements between the involved institution also when it comes to MRV. So you will be able to identify if there are some gaps at least. Let's see, another question. If my NAMA gets a low score, does it mean that it will have a low chance of receiving finance from financiers? Miguel, do you want to take this, or do you want me to provide some input? Well, I can say that, as mentioned, the tool is a tool available online and it's mostly available for users. So it's up to you to decide what you share and what you keep for yourself. I would say that, of course, if I'm a NAMA financier and I get approached with a person who's scored itself and has a very low score, I would ask why, at least. But we must also remember that there are NAMA financiers that finance diverse types of NAMAs. I mean, there are financiers which are interested in providing finance for mitigation actions at the design level, which are interested in assisting countries in developing mitigation programs. Even with the focus on NDC implementation now, there is a strong focus on assisting countries in elaborating NDC implementation plans. And in this aspect, when you elaborate an NDC implementation plan, it could be also the identification and prioritization of NAMAs in a country. And in a situation like this, the financier doesn't necessarily expect that the country comes up with a program which is readily financeable. So if those premises are clear, I think that a MAP assessment presented by the NAMA designer to a potential financiers shows actually to the financier that the NAMA designer has taken the energy to try to identify its own strengths and weaknesses in the mitigation action design, and that is actually a positive thing to show to NAMA financiers, that the NAMA designer, the NAMA proponent, is aware of its own role and the stage of its own mitigation action. So I would say that the score and the possibility of finance will depend on the mitigation action itself, the financiers that you approach, and the scope of the finance, and at what level your NAMA is. Of course, if you're looking for finance for implementation, on the other hand, I would say that having a low score, it could be an indicator that is a risk investment for the financiers. But then again, if you have a NAMA where it has a fairly low score on the program design, but has a top score on the financial module, which is very unlikely, let me say this, I would say that maybe an investor could be willing to go into it. Or if the score of the program module is low because of lack of exact greenhouse gas emission calculations and MRV methodologies, a commercial bank is not necessarily concerned too much with those problems. So I would say that it also depends which financiers you try to approach and for what scope. I don't see any more questions. So I would like to finish this webinar here. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope you got some new and exciting information. I hope you will go into the MAAP online and play with it, assess your mitigation actions, upload your results. The webinar will be uploaded on the NAM Academy website, so if you find this webinar relevant and informative, you will be able to share the same information with colleagues or other interested parties. Thank you very much again for joining. Thank you very much, Miguel, and see you at the next NAM Academy.